Good morning. Thank you for your time today. We're always grateful to be able to connect with you all. My name is Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. Before we get started, I wanted to point out that I have several colleagues on the call today who will be able to answer your questions via the chat function, so please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. They will answer your questions directly, and they'll also let me know of any questions that they think will be helpful for the entire group. I do also want to note that if they don't have time to answer your question immediately, or if you have to leave before you receive a response, our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. So the plan for today is to cover the topic of service projects. We'll start off by defining our terms by contrasting service projects with events, and then we'll move into examples and look at some use cases for service projects. Next, we'll address reviewing and approving service project applications. We'll take a look at how service project activity can be recorded, both by you and volunteers. And then finally, we're going to overview the service project schedule feature and how that might fit into some of your regular volunteering needs. So to start off, we're going to talk about, again, the difference between events versus service projects. And this is something that we can see by going into Add a New Opportunity. Of course, this is the menu that you use to create any new event or project. So within Service, there is an opportunity type for every opportunity you create, and we have two types of events. We have normal events and time slot events, and then of course service project. The main difference between events versus projects is that events have dates and times associated with them. Essentially, when you're creating an event in Service, whether it's a normal event or a time slot event, you're defining specific dates and times that volunteers should be arriving for shifts. So you can kind of think of that in those terms, whether it's a normal event, which is essentially a single shift, or a time slot event where you can create multiple different shifts for volunteers to sign up for. Service projects, on the flip side of that, do not have dates and times associated with them. Instead, they have a date range during which activity can be recorded. So this date range could, of course, reflect when something is taking place. For example, maybe you have an intern who's going to be operating within a certain season. You could have the start date reflect when they'll begin and the end date reflect when that internship is over. Or if this is something that's more long form, like a mentoring program or an office aide or something like that, where someone is working with you over an extended period of time and there's not really any end date in sight, you can actually push this end date back as far as you want to. And then under the advanced options, you can tell the system not to display your service project dates. So again, the hallmark really defining the difference between events versus projects is that within either of the event types, you are creating shifts that your volunteers are registering for on a daily basis or however frequently it's occurring. But with service projects, instead, you create a long form opportunity within which someone can record activity as they serve. So a few examples that you might encounter when you're thinking about service projects. I mentioned the idea of like a mentoring program or something like a coaching program. Again, the idea here being that volunteers are sort of engaging this on their own time, maybe within some structured hours, but it's occurring on their time and they record the activity after the fact. Another example, I mentioned office aides or interns. Again, in this example, maybe people are working with you much more consistently. And in fact, maybe it is even essentially shift-based. Maybe they're coming in 5 days a week. But instead of having somebody sign up for a shift every day of the week, you could just have them log their activity. And that can be done through the sign-in console or after the fact. And we'll get into that more in a bit. A couple other examples, maybe you have something like on-the-street volunteers or sort of independent operating volunteers, maybe more like contract work. Maybe you've hired somebody to create some posters for you or just hang up some posters. Again, that's something they'd kind of be doing on their own time, and then they can report that information or those hours back to you. Another very common example is something like trail or park or grounds maintenance. Again, the theme here being that people are operating sort of on their own time and then just reporting back to you when they record that activity. One final example that I want to mention is the idea of sort of on-site hours or maybe just like pop-in volunteers. If you ever have the case where volunteers stop by and, they want to work with you for a little bit, but there's not really any scheduled operating hours or any scheduled events or shifts happening, then you could use a service project to record that type of activity. If that's something like dog walking or just sorting or filing paperwork or any sort of like on-site or day of service. So one of the hallmarks about service projects is that by default, they have an application process. So let's take a look at how you engage volunteer applications for service projects. And the first thing I want to mention about that is that you can still set restrictions for service projects. So if you're only accepting applications from volunteers within a particular age group or who have completed a certain background check or training or orientation, you can set those requirements or restrictions in order to prevent applications from volunteers who just don't even meet the requirements. And those are set in the exact same manner as you do with events. So when you create a new opportunity, there's a section for application restrictions, and you can come in here and set those restrictions based on information that you are tracking. So again, this can span things like gender or age requirements, background checks, custom fields, checklist items, group membership, and any of those things can be used in combination with one another as well. So if you have very complex restrictions, those could be set also. So I wanted to mention that before we kind of get into it. But of course, if someone does meet your requirements, then they would need to apply for your project first. And then once they've applied, then you would need to either approve or reject that application before someone could begin recording activity. So that is kind of an important part of service projects. So when someone applies for a service project, that application or that open application will show up in two different places that you can find. One of them is directly on the main dashboard. Under Opportunity Management, there's a section called Review Open Service Project Applications, and this allows you to view any open application for projects that you have permission to engage with. So of course, if you're an administrator, you'll see every open application within here. If you're someone like an event leader and you only have access to a particular service project, then you'd only see those applications within here. But from this page, you can see when somebody applied, who it is that applied, what they applied for, and then on the right, who's the organizer for that project. And then finally, you can also see any application notes that they may have included when they applied, as well as if you're using custom registration questions for that service project, you'll be able to click and review that person's responses and of course the questions themselves. So you can see in this case, for this project, I asked someone to provide a reference name and number, their current employer, highest level of education, and a volunteer history. So these are things that I don't need all of my volunteers to provide to me when they're working with me. So they're not on the general application, but they are custom registration questions for this particular project. Now, if you have questions about custom registration questions, we do have a webinar on that topic as well. So we'd be happy to send that along to you. Just, of course, let us know. So from this menu, you can come in here and approve or disapprove service project applications. So that can be done directly through here. Now, as is kind of the rule of thumb within Service, if you are taking an action as an administrator, the system will not send emails on your behalf unless you are clicking a button that actually says to send an email. So in this case, if I just approve an application, it adds someone into that project, but they don't necessarily receive a notification of that unless I choose to enable that here. So likewise with disapprovals, if I don't want someone to be a part of this project, I can just disapprove them. That removes them from the list. They're not added to the project. They can't record activity. They're also not notified that they've been disapproved unless I choose to send that automated notification. Of course, in lieu of that, I could choose to manually email someone directly. There's an option to do so directly on this screen. Now, I said there's two places where you can engage these applications. The other place is through the opportunity management side of the system. So if we go into search and manage existing opportunities, on this page, you can review any open event or project that you have. And of course, I could search for something by name. But if we scroll down here, you can see the project that I want to take a look at, this Reading Mentors project. And if there are any open applications for a project, you'll see this inbox icon, and that inbox icon will also be flashing to let you know there's a notification within that. And if we click on this, this takes us to basically the exact same menu, except of course this is limited to this particular project. So once a volunteer has been approved for a project, then they can begin recording activity. Now, before we dive into that, I do want to mention one caveat. If you have a service project that you don't need to approve or vet all of your registrations, then you can set that project to automatically approve all applications. So there's a setting for that when you create a service project. It says automatically approve service project applications. And if you set this to yes, which is not the default is no, but if you set this to yes, then this kind of functions a little bit more like a direct registration. Individuals would still have to meet your requirements or your restrictions, but if they do, they can register directly and then begin recording activity. Now, how a volunteer can record activity also depends on a setting in the service project itself, and this is unique for each project. There's an item in here called log service project hours, and this setting has 4 different options. So the first is admin only, that's the default behavior. And if you have this at admin only, then it's exactly what it sounds like. Volunteers cannot record activity on their own. But of course, you as an admin or other staff members could record activity for the volunteers. And when I say staff members, I mean admin or leadership team, because they generally have access to all of those types of things. But then also, of course, the organizers for this project would be able to record activity. The other 3 options are for volunteers, but they don't affect whether or not administrators can engage hours. So there's online, on-site, and both. Online means that a volunteer can log into their profile and record hours directly. I'll show you an example of that in a moment here. But this is just basically a place for volunteers to just log into their account and record hours after the fact. Of course, they can't forecast those hours or record things that have not yet taken place. On-site means that volunteers are recording hours through the sign-in console. So if you have the sign-in console set up at a location like a front desk, then when a volunteer arrives, they can sign in. When they leave, they sign out. That records exactly how long they were there, kind of like a punch card. So that can be true for both the standalone sign-in console as well as mobile sign-in. Both of those have sort of the same functionality. If you want to use mobile sign-in with a service project, you also need to choose to enable that. So I mentioned the idea of like trail or park or kind of grounds maintenance, where someone's not necessarily logging in from, a main desk, might be totally remote. You could tell the system to allow that person to use mobile sign-in at any location. And what that will do is it will basically track their, date and time of sign-in, but also the location. So if you did need that sort of information for safety purposes, you could see where someone logged in from or where they signed in from, as well as where they signed out from. All right, so that's the on-site option. And then of course, both would enable both of those options for volunteers. So let me show you real quick what it looks like from the volunteer perspective to record activity. So I'm going to switch over to the volunteer access, and I just want to show you this in case you haven't seen it before. As an admin, if you just want to quickly see the volunteer perspective, you can do so through your own profile. If you go to the profile icon here, click on View as Volunteer Access Level. That'll just switch you over to the volunteer perspective. So from this menu, if a volunteer is registered for a service project, meaning they applied and were approved, or you had that direct application process enabled, or you as an admin just added someone directly into a project. And if that project allows them to record hours online, then they'll see the option to record or update service project activity under registration management. And within that menu, they can see their name, select their project. Let's say I came in yesterday and I was here for an hour and a half, and it was a good time had by all. We can add notes about that as a volunteer. These are visible, of course, on the admin side as well. If I record this activity, we can see that information below here. As a volunteer, I do have permission to review these once I've created them and remove them. So if I need to re-add this entry, I could do so. From the administrative perspective, you have a little bit more access. One other note I want to mention about recording service project activity is that you can choose to log impact with that as well. So in my case, for example, with this Reading Mentors project, we keep track of how many pages were read by the students during each session. So I can go in as a volunteer after I've recorded the hours, and I can choose to record or update volunteer impact. So from this menu, I could scroll down to my latest entry, and maybe we read 15 different pages. And I could also note the name of the book here, or other information that I want to include, and I can log that impact. And then this information can be reported on in basically the same manner as hours. Again, we have a webinar on this topic specifically, so if you have any questions about setting up impact tracking or how you can utilize that, we do have another webinar on that topic specifically. Okay, so that's recording activity from, again, kind of the volunteer perspective. Now I'm going to switch back to the admin access. So just like we did earlier to switch to the volunteer access, I'll go to the profile icon here and switch to administrator access level. This is true for any person with higher than volunteer access. If you accidentally log in on the volunteer side of service, you don't need to log out and go back to the admin login page. You could just go in here and say switch to admin access level. But I want to show you from here how an administrator can engage hours that are recorded for volunteers and of course record them themselves. So that's done, of course, through the opportunity management section. If we go into search and manage existing opportunities, from this page, we can scroll down to locate a project we want to engage with, and we'll see the same sort of icons that we saw on the volunteer side, but there's a shortcut here for logging service project activity. And if we go into this menu, from here at the top of the page, I can select any individual. I can enter in a date that that person came in, how many hours they served. Again, I could add notes, and then I can log that activity. Now on this page, I am also reviewing all activity between these two dates. So they are filtered by default. Typically this would be the start date of the project and then 1 year in the future, or in this case, sorry, a month in the future. But we can see, all of the recorded activity from volunteers within that time frame. It is sorted by the volunteer's name initially, but you could also sort by the service date or the number of hours if you prefer. So if you wanted to see if there's any outliers in terms of too long of recorded hours, maybe somebody forgot to sign out on the sign-in console, and you want to see if there's 100 hours recorded in one instance, something like that, you could do so. Now, all of these entries can also be manipulated from the admin perspective. So if there's any notes, you can go in and edit those notes. If you need to log impact, maybe they forgot to do so, again, you could do that through here directly. And then you also have the ability to adjust hours. So if someone, put something in as an error, they have the wrong number of hours, whatever it was, you could always go in and adjust those manually. And then of course, any of these entries can also be removed. Just select the entry, and then at the bottom of the page, choose to remove the entry. Okay, so that's kind of recording and logging activity from the admin perspective. Now there's one other thing that I want to mention. You can record this same type of information in the volunteer's profile. So if you go through the volunteer database into a volunteer's account, which I just clicked on the name of an individual from that page, but you could also go through search and manage volunteer database, search for an individual, and then go and record activity. There's an option here, same sort of icon, to add or view volunteer service project hours. And this has the same sort of options, but of course this is from the volunteer's perspective as opposed to from that project. And so in this case, we'll be able to select a project and then pick a date, a time, enter in the number of notes or whatever else. Okay, so that's recording activity. The last aspect of service projects that we're going to take a look at today is called service project schedules. Now, this is a feature that allows you to forecast service times for a volunteer with whom you kind of have an established relationship or some sort of handshake agreement about when and how frequently they'll be engaging with this project. So if, for example, in that Reading Mentors project, I have an individual who has told me they're going to come in every Tuesday from 9 a.m. to noon. Well, I could record that as basically a forecasted service project schedule, and I could list that out for the coming Tuesdays through the end of the semester if I wanted to. The way I would do that is by going into Manage this opportunity. So go to Manage the Service Project. And then in the second block of options, which are all pertaining to registrations, there's an item called Manage Service Project Schedules. Within this menu item, I can select an individual. So let's say this person said they're going to be here, again, maybe every Tuesday from 9 a.m. to noon. I could go and select those times, and I could essentially just build out a schedule for this. Now, in this case, I'm only creating one entry. Right, so I've only generated one entry so far. If I wanted to forecast this through the end of the semester, you use a function similar to managing time slots and creating repeating time slots. On the left-hand side, there's an option to repeat this schedule entry. So if I click on this calendar icon here with this kind of duplicated icon, if I click on that, I can choose the days of the week to repeat this. So if it were every day, I could do that. But in this case, we're just doing every Tuesday. Then I can choose the frequency. So every week, every other week, or just once a month. In this case, we're going to do one every week. And then we can give it a start date. So we already have one for yesterday. Let's go ahead and just go through the end of May. If I click on Create Repeating Schedule now, it's going to generate a copy of that schedule, so 9 a.m. to noon, every Tuesday through the end of May. Now, right now I'm only viewing through the end of April. It's only showing me 3 months at a time here, but I could push that back if I wanted to see more information. So the point of doing this is that now I can visualize this schedule when I'm looking at the calendar. Of course, I can see that information through here. If those hours get logged, then I can also see that those hours have been logged with this time clock action or this time clock icon. If the hours haven't been logged, then that icon won't be there. So these are forecasted hours. They do not count in reports. They only get recorded if the hours are recorded in some other method. Now you could actually record them after the fact. You can go in here and click on log hours. That has to be done after the fact, so I won't be able to do that for this entry for next week. But you could do that after the fact if you wanted to, or if hours were recorded on that date by any of the other methods that we already talked about, whether the volunteer used the sign-in console or mobile sign-in, if they just logged into their account and said they were there for 2.5 hours, then the system would identify that those hours had been logged, and of course they'd be correctly attributed based on how long the person was present. So this is one place to review that. But I can also see these calendar entries. If we go back to the opportunity dashboard, there's a calendar view on this page, which you may be familiar with. But if we expand this calendar view, we can see all of our events within here, of course, but we can also see those scheduled projects. So if we have any service project schedules with individuals, in this case, I actually have a couple other entries for individuals who are working in an office with us. Let's go ahead and take a look at next month. So let's go to February here. And if we scroll down, I can kind of get an idea of who's going to be there and at what time. I can see those entries within here. These are not displayed to volunteers. So volunteers won't see this on their calendar in terms of, viewing what else other people are doing. This is really just a way for you to sort of visualize who you have coming in, and at what time. One quick note about this calendar is that it can be filtered. So if I only wanted to view that Reading Mentors project, I could search by that. And then I wouldn't be viewing all the other opportunities or shifts going on at that time. So again, the point of doing service project schedules is to provide a way for you to visualize an engagement that you have with a volunteer. If you already have some sort of handshake agreement with them, that they're coming in every Tuesday, like in this case, I could actually build that out, and that way I can see that on my calendar. So if I have another person who wants to come in, maybe I'd say, well, we already have one person coming in Tuesday morning. So either that's a good thing or a bad thing to have another person there at the same time, but I have the ability to see that and sort of forecast that and help kind of align those schedules. So today we covered an overview of pretty much all the different aspects of service projects and how you can utilize them within your system. We didn't walk through, all the different settings. So of course, if you have any questions about settings on projects themselves, we'd be happy to take those, but we're going to move into a Q&A time now. Our team has been answering questions throughout the call, but I will be taking questions for the larger group as they come in, so please feel free to continue writing in those questions. So a question came in about application approval or disapproval letters, those notes that we mentioned. So if you go into Review Open Applications, you can approve or disapprove those applications. And where this email is customized is in the system configuration. So if you go into the system configuration under System Management, there's a section called Email Message Content. Within that section, you'll see options to modify the service project application automatic approval and automatic disapproval message. So that's where you can edit essentially the intro text for those messages. So another question came in regarding using the sign-in console in conjunction with service projects. And that question is, how do you find all the volunteers who forgot to sign out of their service project? Which is a really great question. So if you are using the sign-in console to have volunteers sign in and sign out to record their activity for a service project, for service projects, the system doesn't kick out those sign-ins until the person chooses to sign out, or in a particular exception, and we'll talk about that in a moment here. But if you have the sign-in console set up and a volunteer signs in for their shift or for their service project, but then they neglect to or forget to sign out, then that will just kind of keep going until you choose to cancel that or close it out yourself. So to go and review those, you could open up the sign-in console in admin mode, and that will show you anybody who is currently signed in and what they're signed in for. So if you wanted to go through this and sign people out if it was after the fact, or if their service project was done, you could also cancel sign-ins and then just go and manually attribute hours if you want to do it that way. In case someone was signed in for like a week at a time or something like that, you could actually see that through here, when they signed in. And you could either just sign them out, which again would attribute those hours to that person, or you could cancel the sign in and do that manually. Now, I mentioned there's an exception to those sign-ins kind of remaining in perpetuity. There's a setting in the system configuration under the sign-in console or kiosk options to enable the sign-in console automatic sign-out. Now, this is set to no by default. But if you choose to enable this, you can select kind of a default number of credit hours that volunteers will receive specifically for service projects. There's also a case where you can use this with events if you set the event to be worth 0 credit hours, but we're not going to get into that right now. So for service projects, though, if you want to, you can set basically a default. So if you find that volunteers are consistently forgetting to sign out, and you don't want to have to deal with that, what you could do is set up a default in here. 1 hour, half an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever you want to do. Kind of whatever your most common shift is what I typically recommend. Otherwise, I would do the minimum because this kind of sticks out and you can easily see if it's only a half an hour. And then also the onus is on the volunteer. If they want to get more than half an hour of credit, they better be signing out as well. But if you turn this option on, what happens is this is not a cap, so it doesn't prevent people from recording more than that amount of activity. For example, if I have this set to half an hour, if a volunteer signs in for a service project at 8 a.m. and then they leave at 11 a.m. and they sign out, they're going to get 3 credit hours, right? And so it's not capped by this number. What happens is if that same person, let's say they sign in the next day at 8 a.m. and then they leave at 11, but they forget to sign out, the system at night will go through and check, is anybody still signed in? And if they are, then it will kind of cancel that and then give them the default credit hours. So it'll still remember when they signed in, but then it will just give them half an hour of credit if you have that turned on. Yeah, very good question. So again, we kind of got here because we were talking about, how can you see if someone did forget to sign out? And again, the short answer to that is you can just open up the sign-in console in admin mode, and you'll be able to review all the current people who are signed in, when they signed in, and what they signed in for. So a question came in about approving applications for service projects and kind of what that does essentially. If I approve someone for an application, do I still need to sign them up for that project? That's a good question. The answer is no. If you approve someone for an application, or if you approve someone's application for a project, that does complete their registration. So if we go and look at, for example, the 2 that I have right here applied. So we have Jane Rogers who applied for this project. If I approve this person for Reading Mentors, if I approve the application, that removes it from this listing, obviously. But now if I go into manage the registered individuals for this project, which let's actually go from the main dashboard here. So if I go into search and manage opportunities, I can go down to this project and there's an option here to, of course, log activity. We talked about that already. But there's also the ability to just see who is registered. And if I go into register individuals or see who's registered, then Jane Rogers is going to show up in this list because I approved her application. So approving someone's application for a project is the same thing as directly registering them. It's just kind of a part of a 2-step process in that scenario where first the volunteer expresses interest and then second you approve them for that project. Again, you can kind of forego that if you'd like to, just by directly searching for an individual and then registering them for this project directly. Okay, so a good question came in. what's the process for removing a service project that will no longer be used? That's an excellent question. So if you have some kind of opportunity, like a mentorship program that you thought was going to go on forever, and that program has kind of been folded into something else or removed from your system, if you have a service project that you used to actively use to record activity and is no longer part of that programming, you don't need to delete any of that information. And in fact, I would recommend against that. And also, Service won't let you delete any activity without first removing essentially everything from that project. So, for example, let's say this Reading Mentors program is something that I'm no longer engaging with. And I have a couple different ways that I could choose to essentially archive this project. The simplest way is to just go in and update the event or update this project. And then down here, change the opportunity status to closed. A closed opportunity is, in Service terms, essentially archived. So if you close an opportunity, that will no longer be displayed for volunteers, even if Publish Online is set to Yes Open. I might do this at the same time just to be pedantic, but you don't need to. You can leave that as Yes Open. When a project is closed or when an event is closed, then that would mean that volunteers can no longer engage with this. It's essentially archived. It's not going to show up on your event listing page. And it's also not going to be an option for recording activity. So even if I have this set to what it is now, both volunteers could record hours online or on site, it's not going to show up anywhere because this is now an archived project. So that's kind of the simplest way to take care of that. If you wanted to kind of round it out and actually identify, well, this is the date that we stopped engaging with this project, I might choose to do that myself. That way I have a good record of, this project actually lasted from this date to this date. I might choose to do that personally, but that's of course up to you. But yeah, really you just want to close the opportunity, and that would essentially archive all of that information. So you wouldn't need to do anything like removing volunteers from the project or removing hours. And in fact, again, I would advise against that because that way you still have historic data within the system. Another question that comes up along those same lines is what to do if you've kind of fired someone from a service project. They used to be a part of this Reading Mentors program, but we no longer allow them to do that. Well, in that scenario, it's actually pretty straightforward as well. Essentially, what you do is go in to view the registered volunteers, and then whomever you're choosing to fire from that position, you can select that individual, and then just remove them from this project. Their hours will still remain in the project, but they will no longer be able to record activity. Of course, they could still apply again if this is an open project, but you could always just disapprove that. But they, as long as you have that application process in place, they would not be able to just record activity again because they wouldn't be a part of the project anymore. Okay, another question came in kind of about the application process for service projects in general, asking, does a volunteer need to be registered in Service prior to applying for a service project? It's a good question. Not necessarily, because the application process for a specific service project generally entails creating a profile as well if someone doesn't already have one. So let me just show you kind of what that looks like from the volunteer perspective. You can choose to post your projects in a number of different ways. What I'm showing you right now is called the service project listing page, but these can also be displayed on the event listing page just alongside all of your other opportunities. But let's say an individual is interested in my Reading Mentors program. This page that I'm showing you right now is a logged out perspective. If you went to the same link, you would see the same thing. You do not have to have a profile to view this page in our demo console. But if I click on this Reading Mentors at Halbertson Elementary, if I click into this project, I can read more about it. Down at the bottom, I can click on Apply to Participate. And then that will take me to what's called the account check page. Now the system remembers me because I told it to. But if I said not Bruce, it takes me to this account check page, which asks for my email address and my first name. So again, it's basically just checking, does this person already have a profile? So if that's the case, if it recognizes my combination of email and name, then it will just ask for my password. It'll ask me to log in. But if it doesn't recognize my information, meaning I don't already have a profile, then it will take me to the application page where I'll be creating an account as a part of the application for this project. So a volunteer does not necessarily need to have a profile before applying for a service project because the system will check whether or not they already have an account before it actually gets to that application part. So volunteers will be prompted to create profiles as a part of the application process. Now, there is kind of a caveat to that. You can choose to limit visibility of service projects, which is a form of restricting registration to only those people who already meet the requirements. In that scenario, someone would have to log into their account in order to see the open applications. But that's kind of a bit of a different scenario, kind of a specific use case. Okay, so another question came in about the applications and what happens to open applications. So if I were to approve or reject someone in here, we talked about kind of the approval case. If someone's approved, they're registered for the project. It just removes this application from this menu, but it doesn't really touch their profile otherwise. If I disapprove someone, again, it just removes that application from this menu. It doesn't delete their profile. So they will still have an account in Service. They could apply for other things, sign up for other events. If they had other registrations, of course, all that data would remain there. Disapproving an application effectively just removes them from this list. Okay, a lot of good questions come in, which is great. Keep it up. Another question came in about the service project schedules. So with service project schedules, if someone records activity longer than the duration of what you had scheduled them for. So for example, I had mine set up to be 9 a.m. to noon in this example. If that person came in early, let's say they got there at 8 a.m. and they also stayed until noon, then if they're using the sign-in console to record that activity, that will be exactly what they receive. So these schedules are just a framework. They don't dictate how many hours are being logged. The only case where that applies is if you choose to go into that service project schedule and manually log those hours through this menu, then it will use kind of the default because you're just logging hours this way. But if they're recording activity themselves by logging in and saying I was there for 2.5 hours or 4.5 hours, or if they're using the sign-in console, then those hours will override what this sort of framework is providing. So also on the kind of back on this like service project schedule, there's another question about manipulating this in the future. So let's say, for example, we got through the end of February and then this person said, well, I can't do 9 a.m. to noon anymore. Can I do the afternoons? What you can do is there's an option here to delete repeating schedules. And what this does is it actually deletes this entry and all of those forecasted beyond it. So if I deleted that, then it would just remove everything from that date forward. And I could essentially just make a new one for whatever the newly agreed schedule is. Okay, and then another question came in about seeing and printing a list of volunteers on a project. So that kind of takes a couple different flavors depending on what you're looking for. If you just want to see the list of individuals who are a part of a project, you can just go into view the registered volunteers. From this menu, of course, you can email people if you want to. You can also print this out. You can do like sign-in sheet kind of thing through here. You can also, from this menu, if you select all these results, you can click on Manage Selected Volunteers, and then that will take you to the volunteer database side of the system, and it will show you all those individuals. And then from here, there's a whole host of things that you can do. I could send an email, of course. I can print address labels, name tags, PDF of their contact info. I could print out a spreadsheet, which is basically like a data export, which you could fully customize to. So there's a lot of different things you could do with that listing. Now, this is just the list of individuals who are registered. This is none of the activity. So if I wanted to view the activity for this project in like a report format, that's most easily done via report management. And specifically, I would probably just use this second report option here, which is called Event or Project Participation Report. First of all, you want to set your date range. So if you want to view like all the activity in 2021, you could go and set your date range for that specific range. And then you would go and search for whatever the project is. So if I wanted to do that Reading Mentors project, you can just use a keyword in here to run a search essentially. And then you can choose how much detail you want to include. Low detail basically just gives you a summary for each person. High detail would show you every single registration, so every entry of hours being recorded. And then you can also select if you want to use a Word document format or a spreadsheet format for this printout. There's a number of other reports you can do that would get that same kind of information. Again, it just kind of depends on exactly what you're looking for. but just briefly, the custom participation report is also an excellent tool for that because you can use a search to limit these results to that one opportunity or those specific individuals. I could use that search that I just ran to only view those individuals. Now that would include, anything those individuals had done. So anyway, there's different ways to do that, just kind of depending on what your end goal is. Okay, so a good question came in about the application itself versus what I just kind of briefly mentioned as custom registration questions. So the application itself is sort of a fixed standard in your database. You can edit that in the system configuration under information collection and custom fields. This is basically where you establish what your application is. And this is the general profile that everybody needs to create when they're signing up for any of your events, right? So I've used the terms application and profile kind of throughout the call today. We've talked specifically about service project applications, which is essentially just somebody expressing interest in a service project. In this context, we're talking about the profile. So an individual filling out all the information required for your volunteer profile. And again, that's set up and collected in the system configuration. That's where you establish what's in that data. One other topic we talked about in that vein was the idea of custom registration questions. So if your particular project, like in my case, that Reading Mentors project requires that volunteers also provide the name and number of a reference, some of their volunteer or employee history, different information like that, which is unique for this particular project. So custom registration questions are an extra layer on top of that base profile that we just talked about that would be required when someone is applying for or signing up for this service project specifically. Now, any event or project can have custom registration questions applied to it. And again, we have a webinar on this topic that goes in good detail. But just to show you briefly, if you click on this question mark icon for a project or an event, any of the questions you've previously created will show up in here. If you don't see anything here, that means you haven't created any yet. So to create those, click on Manage Registration Questions. So if I wanted to create another question, that's exactly how I would do that. Like if I wanted to ask, what language someone can speak or something like that, I could generate a question like that. But then on the right-hand side, you can see these checkboxes indicate whether or not these questions are a part of this particular project or event. So what the system does is when a volunteer is registering for or applying for this project, before they complete their application, meaning expressing interest in this project. So after they've created their profile, before they've completed the registration or application for this project, they will be presented these questions and asked those as a part of the registration for this particular project. So it's an additional layer of information that you can collect in certain scenarios. Service projects are a great example of that because like in this case, I want a reference name and number because this is a Reading Mentors program. You're working with kids. So this is, kind of more stringent than some of my other opportunities where you're just working outside on a trail or different things like that. So you can basically customize when someone is signing up for this particular project, how much information they need to provide for you. Okay, very good. Well, we got through a whole lot of questions there, and I'm sure there's still some floating out there. I want to point out before we go here that if you have questions about any of this topic, or if you want any of the links to the other webinars that I mentioned, if you don't already have those, then you can always get that information from our customer support team. Whenever you're logged in as an admin, at the bottom of the page, you'll see this Need Help button, and this is how you engage with our customer support team. If you click on that button, it brings up a dialog, asks how can we help? So if you want to learn about, custom registration questions or something like that, you can type in a topic through here, view articles that have to do with that. But regardless what you searched by, you can always click on Contact Us and then submit a support request. So our customer support team has posted hours of Monday through Saturday, 8:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And they generally respond within 30 minutes to an hour. They're very prompt. So feel free to use this tool as often as you need to. If you have any questions about stuff that we talked about today, or just other things that might have brought up, the other webinars that I mentioned, things like that, feel free to submit questions through there. So I just want to thank you for your time today. It's a pleasure to see you in the chat. I know I've met with a lot of you directly, so thank you so much for joining. We as a team are grateful for the work that you do throughout all the different organizations and communities that you're serving and impacting. Partnering with you is one of the most satisfying aspects of our work. So again, if you have any questions about this topic specifically or just your system as a whole, use our customer support tool, get those questions answered. Otherwise, thank you for your time again, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.